Hi there, my name's Ed Hill, and this is another in a series of videos related to the podcast A Grand Tour with my Great Great Grandad. Now, in this one, I decided that I'd do an interview with the railway historian Anthony Dawson, because basically the journals that the podcast is about were written by my Great Great Grandad William Mowbray Scott about his time travelling around Europe in the 1840s as a railway engineer, and later on they then recount his time also in Mexico working in the mint there. But the first part of the journals is all related to this time that he has, spending about 2 years in Milan working as a railway engineer on what was in fact the second oldest railway, or is the second oldest railway in Italy, and that goes from Milan to Monza. And at that time it was quite common that railway engineers from the UK would be sent out to new railways in Europe, essentially to drive the trains that were being exported by UK manufacturers to run on the lines in Europe. Now, this is particularly the locomotives, the sort of carriages and railways themselves were obviously built in Italy by Italian engineers, but when it came to the locomotives, many of them were being manufactured in the UK by companies such as Stephenson. And in William's case, it's actually by a company called J&G Rennie in London, and they built the steam trains. And William gets the job as a superintender, if you like, or director of the railway. Essentially, it's the foreman role, kind of making sure that everything runs okay as the railway starts operation in Milan. So his job is not only driving the trains, but also basically running the whole works and making sure that everything kind of, from an engineering perspective, is run along the right lines, and the train works and the service works. So that's his job, and he does that for about 2 years. So I wanted to do this interview with Anthony basically to get some more information about the sort of development of railways at that time, both technologically and also sort of geographically and politically, because obviously William doesn't write so much about that. In fact, William's journals are mainly about the kind of cultural sights and sounds that he sees, and some of the kind of the landscape and the history about the places he's visiting. And he doesn't talk a huge amount about his time actually working on the railway, but there's enough detail in there, and he does give some interesting nuggets, particularly about the sort of first time he drives a train and the opening ceremony and things like that. And this interview actually is also available as a podcast. It's episode 25 of A Grand Tour with my Great Great Grandad. So if you Google that, it'll come up and you can listen to it on any sort of podcast platform you have. But if you go to episode 25, this is basically this interview with Anthony. But actually, when it came to the video, I've split the interview into two halves, because the original interview is about an hour long, and it seemed a bit long to do a YouTube video for a whole hour on this subject. So this is basically why I'm doing this introduction, really, so I can explain that this sort of first half is related to the early technological development, if you like, from the end of the 18th century up to the sort of mid 19th century. And it's very useful because Anthony actually tells me a lot of things that I didn't really know about, or I'd kind of made assumptions about what I thought I knew about early railways, and he kind of puts me straight on things. So it's, really interesting from that perspective. But I just thought it'd be nice to kind of get more background knowledge and more information about this whole period where the railways, the development of the railways was having a massive impact actually not only in Europe but also in the world, really, because it was really the start of modern travel as we know it. So, I've likened it to the introduction of the internet, really, in our own era, which of course has transformed everyone's lives, and is a reason I'm doing this video and able to put it on YouTube for you to watch. So as I say, this is the first part of the interview with Anthony. I do hope you enjoy it, and thanks for watching. So I'm delighted to be joined by Anthony Dawson, who's a railway historian and very much specialises in the early railways, which is the time which William was involved in. So, Andy, I wondered if I could first ask you why that era of steam railways appeals to you so much.
I think it's because it's the beginnings of it. It's the fundamental start of it all. It's where it all began, and it's where they established the basic principles of what the railways were, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There'd been various forms of railways in Britain since the Elizabethan period, and with wooden wagonways and then plateways and so forth. But the 1820s, 1830s, where you start to get the evolution of the steam railway and the idea of a public railway. And that's where it all begins. And to understand where you end up at the end of the steam period in 1968, you need to really understand what they were doing 138 years earlier, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's laying the foundations of what came later. And the fact is that they got the foundations right from the start, and they pretty much had to.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose also there was I suppose that was the huge technological leap, if you like. I mean, the principle of a steam-powered, the principle of it, if you like, they'd actually made that principle work, which was the massive technical development. Before that, steam engines had been stationary. And so forth. So, everything else is just like further iterations of improving that massive technological leap, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So it's very much the real beginnings of it. You actually touched on something very interesting there, saying that, because I've mentioned this question about how perhaps George Stephenson and the rocket seem to get, known as that sort of kind of landmark moment, but actually, by 1840, for example, which is the time William's working on the railways, actually the steam railways had been, the development of those engines and that technology had been going on for quite a long time, hadn't it? So it was, and there were lots of companies involved as well, as I understand. So I just wondered if you could kind of comment a bit more on that, almost like pre Stephenson history, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, by 1840, the steam locomotive was a mature technology. The very first locomotive engine, i.e. a self-propelled steam engine, actually goes back well before people like Stephenson and Trevithick. It goes back to France, to Nicolas Cugnot, who built his Fardière Vapeur, or steam drag or steam carriage, in 1769. And that was also the first high-pressure steam engine, as it operated at 4 atmospheres. And this is at a time when people like James Watt were building stationary engines which were running on less than 1 atmosphere, maybe about half atmosphere, just a couple of psi, as they thought high-pressure steam engines were dangerous. But Cugnot's road locomotive fell foul of the politics of the time, and then nothing really happened in France. And then in Britain, you have Richard Trevithick coming along with high-pressure steam, with building his high-pressure stationary engines and his high-pressure locomotive engines, including his 2 road coaches, and, of course, his famous locomotive at Penydarren in 1804. But Trevithick was many things, but one of the things he was not was a good businessman.
Right.
And he died in penury in the 1830s, bless him. So it was up to others to take the idea of a self-moving locomotive forward. There's a lot of dead ends. So in the Napoleonic Wars, there was a cost of living crisis, but in particular, a cost of horses crisis.
Right.
So it wasn't just only the cost of fodder to feed the horses, it was also the cost of horses themselves, which had doubled, trebled, quadrupled overnight. So coal owners needed something else to take the coal to market. So you get in Leeds, you have John Blenkinsop and Matthew Murray coming along with their rack and pinion locomotive in 1811. And the very first commercial steam locomotive ran in Leeds in 1812, which is years before rocket came along. But then you also get people building locomotives with legs or pulling themselves along a chain. Because the fundamental problem, the locomotive was essentially too heavy for the brittle cast iron track, which is why Blenkinsop used a rack and pinion system to make so the locomotive was light enough so it didn't break the rails, but then it wasn't heavy enough to pull itself along, so he provided it with a rack and pinion. And the biggest evolution for the railway locomotive isn't the engine itself, but the track it ran on. I've just come back from Scotland excavating the 1722 Tranent Cockenzie wagonway up there, and excavating its iron face from 1815, and that was laid with cast iron rails. They were only 3 feet long and came in a fixed length.
Wow, yes.
Which meant there was a lot of joints.
Yes.
And it meant in trying to lay a curve or go around a corner, you've just got these little short lengths of track and you have to stagger the joints to go around the curve.
Yes.
So it looks like an old-fashioned threepenny bit.
Yes,
it's not a proper curve.
Yes.
And it's not a type of railway where you could actually put a locomotive on it. No. It would just fall to bits. So it's when they come up with wrought iron rail in 15-foot lengths, which can be bent to a curve, you then suddenly have a technology where the locomotive can really spread its wheels, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So before you were struggling with cast iron rails, and then suddenly they have wrought iron rails in 1822, and then that's where you get the major development of the railway, but particularly by George Stephenson, because all the other pioneers had fallen by the wayside. Largely a result of a change in the economy after the Battle of Waterloo, and again with the cost of horses. But Stephenson stuck with it, and it was Stephenson who recognised that a railway is a transport machine, and it's got 2 parts. One part is mobile, and that's the locomotive, and the other part of it is fixed, and that's the track. And you can't have one without the other.
That's very interesting. We sort of touched on that in a kind of a later version of the particular way they did it in the railway that William's working on in Italy. But it is that thing, isn't it? As you mentioned, that development of wrought iron is actually fundamental to the evolution of railways, and the sudden, as you say, you mentioned it's about 1820, isn't it? That must have really been the thing that kicked it on as a feasible way of moving the weights and the tracks and the carriages and everything involved. So and it also impacted on the evolution of the locomotive as well, because Trevithick and Blenkinsop, they'd used cast iron boilers, which isn't terribly safe, but they worked well enough. So again, with the evolution of wrought iron and ever increasing size of wrought iron plate, means you can start having wrought iron rather than cast iron boilers, wrought iron track rather than cast iron track. So that's very interesting. This is a sort of thing regarding the language around railways that struck me in William's journals. He nearly always uses the word railroad, which I kind of always assumed was a kind of an American evolution of railway. But he uses that that term nearly always through the journals, and I just wondered when in Britain the term railway became more prominent rather than railroad. Probably in the 1840s, but railway, railroad, wagonway, wagon road are all colloquialisms, and it all depends about where and abouts in the country you are. So in the 18th century, there were 2 competing schools of railways, one in Shropshire and one up in Durham, around in the northeast around Newcastle.
And the Shropshire School, it was a railway.
Yes.
And they preferred using a narrower gauge, so less than 4 feet.
Yeah.
And up around Newcastle, it was always a wagon road
Right.
or a railroad, and they preferred a wider gauge of, say, 4 foot to 5 foot.
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Michael Lewis, in his book on early railways, says that you can probably tell where the engineer was from, or where somebody from was, how they referred to what we now call a railway, if it was a railway or a railroad, or if it was a wagon road, whether you were a Geordie or you were a Salopian.
Yes. Yeah. So it's kind of almost more a kind of local, or it was originally based on a local thing. Yeah. I think there's a couple of times that William does use the word railway, sort of thing later on, I think, but most of the time it's railroad. There's obviously something that interested me and kind of struck me reading the journals is this kind of obviously there's a very rapid expansion of railway in the UK, but I hadn't quite appreciated how rapidly it kind of happens in the rest of the world, and particularly in Europe, very much with this exporting of the locomotives to foreign countries, which is obviously what's happening with William to Italy. But actually, going on your website, I've noticed there's a lot of accounts of you discussing engines that were exported at that time, but it really was very quickly adopted by, particularly in Europe, wasn't it? This technology, which quite surprised me how rapid that was. I kind of always assumed that sort of Britain was way out in front, but it almost seems almost as soon as the development gets to a point where it's good enough to work, it spreads really fast.
The evolution of the railways in Europe was pretty much curtailed by the Napoleonic Wars due to the massive upheaval, the economic problems, and the continental system, which effectively cut Britain off from the rest of Europe, and not just in terms of the flow of goods and services, but flow of people and ideas, if that makes sense. So we know in 1814, during that very short peace between Napoleon's two abdications, French engineers came over to Britain. They went to the Middleton Railway, saw the railway operating, and came back and published their results, including drawings of the Middleton engines. That was in 1815. In 1817, in Liège, there's one of these Blenkinsop locomotives operating. And two of them are built in Prussia in 1815 and 1816. So European steam railways kick off quite early. And we know German engineers were fascinated by what was going on with the Stockton and Darlington, and two of them called von Dechen and von Eulenhausen came over and studied everything. And their report is a fascinating insight into what was going on for Stockton and Darlington, the Liverpool and Manchester and things like that. But it's the massive success of, say, the Liverpool and Manchester with its international opening that really kickstarts the railway revolution across Europe. But just to go back a little bit, in France, the steam railway there was homemade, was homegrown. Right. You have Marc and Paul Seguin, who were working in the south of France near Lyon, and they wanted to build a steam railway in the early 1820s. And they built their locomotive. I mean, they imported two locomotives from Robert Stephenson and Company, and it was Paul and Marc who actually invented the multitubular locomotive boiler.
Right.
2 years before it was first essayed on rocket. And there's a wonderful letter from Paul Seguin, who was at the Rainhill Trials in 1829, who writes to Marc, because they'd wanted to start exporting locomotives from France to Britain. They saw it as a brilliant business opportunity for their foundry. And Paul Seguin sees rocket, and he says, "Mon Dieu, they have copied our boiler. They've broken our French patent, which we have published. How dare you do this?" And he writes to Marc, And Mark goes, oh, well, bother, there goes that business.
Yeah, gosh.
But then that raises all sorts of questions about who got there first in this flow of technology.
Yes.
Um,
It's very interesting you mentioned that, because one of the reasons I asked that question was at one point in the journal, William comments about he sees a work somewhere and he's travelled down to Italy, and I think it's in France, and he expresses his concern that British technology is being too easily exported, and the know-how is being too easily exported to what you might call our competitors. But it actually strikes me from what you're saying, it was actually a lot more nuanced than that, and a lot more two-way, and who actually was kind of inventing things first and who wasn't quite as straightforward as perhaps William saw it in that way.
Yeah, but the major problem for people in Europe wanting to import new ideas and technology was protectionism, economic protectionism after 1815, both in Britain and France. So in France, they had to pay custom dues up to 50% of the value. And the same was true trying to export into the United States, where custom dues are very expensive. But there was one sneaky way around it, was that in France and in Prussia, if you wanted to import a new technology, you could do so as a scientific model.
Yes.
Free of customs charges.
Yes, yes.
On the understanding that you would not take out a patent on this object you have imported, which is how Marc Sagan imported his two Stephenson locomotives. He imported them as scientific models.
Yes, yes.
One went to Monsieur Allet to be dismantled and drawn, and the other one was squirreled away in Sagan's own workshop to be dismantled and rebuilt.
Yeah. And these were full-size engines, but they just called them models. They just called them models, yeah.
Yeah, and that's how other early French railways were able to import Planet locomotives. They were imported as scientific models to be studied, with the tacit approval of the Minister of the Interior, the Minister of Commerce, and organisations like the Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers in Paris. They'd import these things, dismantle, take drawings of them, and then the Conservatoire would publish a portfolio of all the drawings to go around all the foundries in France, and they would build them.
Yeah, yeah.
The same happened in Germany, but with major foundries in France, for example, like Le Creusot. That had been the old Royal Foundry, but it had been restarted by John and William Wilkinson, British ironmasters who'd come over to restart it before Schneider took on Le Creusot later on. So there's a lot of interplay of technology, but there's also a lot of espionage and trying to get around this protectionism.
Yes. It's funny you mention that, because William mentions when he's in Paris, he goes to see an exhibition of, I think these are static steam engines, but he mentions the models and, Boulton and Watts engines and stuff like that, which by then seems fairly old technology. But I think he's again expressing this concern that these models are kind of, giving the game away of what this technology is. And I imagine they were scaled models rather than actual full scale examples as you're talking. But I suppose the principle is still the same. You can work out how something works from the model, couldn't you?
Yeah, usually scale working models are the 1:8 or 1:5. Right. I mean, today there's a beautiful gallery of models at the Arts et Métiers in Paris. All these scale working models of locomotives and steam engines. And there's a beautiful 1:5 scale model of a Planet locomotive, which was used as a basis where you can copy this and build technology from that. But France had that legacy, the tradition of model building, going back into the 17th century. Same if you go to the Musée de l'Armée and go to Salle Gribeauval, there's all these 1:8, 1:5 scale working models of artillery.
Right, gosh, yes.
And of course, the whole idea of what we would understand as technical drawing.
Yes.
again, that originates in France with the French military, and that was a top military secret.
Yeah. So it was a good way of using or exporting their intellectual property, but in a kind of underhand way, really. Wasn't it?
Yeah.
That's just sort of moving on. To the particular engine that's called the Lombarda, which is the first one that William actually drives in Italy. And I know it was built by J&G Rennie in London. So, and there are two engines. There's the Lombarda and the Milano, I think. Now, this was something I didn't quite sort of realise, but there are all these sort of works, aren't there, building engines? And you said actually each of them are kind of building a version of a locomotive, but they kind of have their own slight differences between the ones which the actual kind of foundries make. So I don't know if J&G Rennie were working off a model of another, person's drawings or whatever. They seem to be very much a more general manufacturer. They're making like biscuit making machines, and they're very much involved in marine and propellers and things like that. But yeah, I just wondered if you could kind of comment on that. As I understand it, the engines actually weren't that reliable when they got out there, and they got some others that were made by Stevenson. But just on this sort of term of, I don't know why perhaps they were chosen as the initial contractor to get the engines from.
Rennie's began as civil engineers because John and George Rennie had been the engineers in Liverpool and Manchester, because they were the right sort of people,
right,
to appeal to the gentry who were basically NIMBYs against the thing. George Stephenson, with his broad Geordie accent, was not the right type of person.
Really.
And George's performance before Parliament as well had been atrocious, with people thinking he was mad and couldn't understand him.
Really?
They obviously hadn't got closed caption subtitling then. But a lot of firms produce locomotives under license from the likes of Stephenson. So you see a lot of firms churning out copies of Stephenson patentee types of 222 passenger engines, or churning out 042 luggage engines, a bit like Lion, just turning them out under license. And Stephensons were very good, thanks to a Quaker chap called Edmund Folger Starbuck, nothing to do with the coffee people.
Yeah.
Who was effectively Stephenson's heavy man and enforcer for his patents.
Right.
And if companies weren't paying up, they send round Starbuck, which is a very peculiar thing to think of a Quaker.
Yes, being
a hard man. Peaceful ever being a hitman or a heavy. But he was also going into Europe as well.
Right.
To enforce patent rights in Europe.
Yes. So it's funny because I know that these two engines, the Lombarda and Milano, run for about a year, I think, and then there are other trains that get exported again while William is still there. But from what I've found out, they were made by Stephenson, and I think they were perhaps a bit more reliable than these ones that were being made by Rennie. But it's very hard to kind of get too much information about that. I think one of the Stephenson's ones may have been called Adder or something, but I don't know if there are any records of what might have been exported by Stephenson's at that time. But I don't know if you know if anything information like that could be.
The Stephenson's archive is really complete.
Is it?
It's confusing because for the first 10 or so years, there's at least 3 or 4 competing works lists, all running their own numbering.
Right.
So you have to work out which order book you're in as to which number series it is. It's very, very confusing.
Right.
And sometimes the handwriting is appalling.
Yes.
But For the early period, up to the 1860s, it's very complete.
Right.
With full specifications of the engine's tender and who's it's intended for and how's it going to get there.
Yeah. So you think there probably would be a good chance that it is recorded somewhere in their archive of the engines that they exported to Milan. Yeah. I'll have to try and get there one time, maybe. Where is their archive? Is
it's at York?
It's at York Railway Museum, is it? Yeah. Okay, I'll have to do a trip up there maybe and get see if I can get.
I've got most of it up to about 1845 on my hard drive.
Right. Oh, well, maybe. I think it might have been something. I've got a reference of one being called something like the Adder or something, or the Arder or something like that. I don't know. Adler. Of course, it could have been an Italian variation on a name as well. So, but I'll have to. It's the one thing I've seen it referenced to, but I mean, it only very briefly. The reason I thought that perhaps. Because I think it's George Rennie had been at one time he'd been master of the Mint in London and supervisor of the machinery and works there, and that's William's previous job as working as an engineer in the Mint in London. And I've kind of assumed there must perhaps be this connection that he kind of knew the company well, and when they exported these engines out there, they said, look, we need someone who can do it, and perhaps they knew William. But actually, that's another thing I mentioned. That's actually very common, isn't it? There's lots of examples where these British made trains are sent out with English or British drivers. William's not actually unusual, because I've seen that referenced in some of your videos that you've made.
It's usually they would send out the locomotives were exported dismantled,
right,
and were sent out usually with one or two fitters. Right. Who would re-erect them and test them at the other end. And 9 times out of 10, the fitter would stay with that engine and become its first driver and take, but not just be the driver, but basically the first locomotive foreman.
Yeah.
Because they knew how these things were built, how these things were maintained, and they would train the first group of drivers, firemen, and very often the guards as well. And in other instances, say in the Leipzig-Dresden railway, importing a complete railway package, locomotive, track, carriages and staff, all exported from Britain.
Oh, right, really, yeah.
Buying it all off the shelf.
Yeah. Because William describes his role as driver and supervisor, I think. And he definitely, at some points in the journal, talks of how he sort of supervised the equipment that should be in the workshops and things like that. So unfortunately it doesn't go into a huge amount of detail, like on the very much sort of nuts and bolts role he has, in a way, which is a little bit sometimes I find a little bit frustrating, because he does tend to be discussing the sort of cultural sights and sounds that he's seeing, perhaps more than the real engineering. So I'm going to end the video here. So that's the end of the first part of the interview with Anthony. It's quite hard to find a good edit point, actually, to cut it at, where we'll start waffling on so much about things because we're enjoying the interview so much. But that's the end of the first half. I hope you've enjoyed it. The second half will be, as I say, a continuation of this discussion with Anthony, because I basically raised some questions about things that strike me reading William's journals that I want to discuss with him. And again, it'll be about a similar length, again, about half an hour. So I do hope you've enjoyed the first part, and hopefully you'll tune in to watch the second part when I've finished editing it. Thanks for watching.